लाइव हो गया। Thank you. Thank you and welcome to our symposium and curtain raiser for the constellation, Understanding Digital Worlds. We've curated two very interesting panel that primarily premise on the two research agendas that we are hosting under our constellation. But before we begin, I'd like to quickly introduce our office, the newly established Office of Interdisciplinary Studies at JGU called IDEAS, which serves as a university-wide incubator for interdisciplinary research by providing an interdomain space for cross-disciplinary learning and research. This is very well witnessed by the diversity of the panelists that we have here this morning. By engaging with scholars from within GGU and outside, practitioners, policymakers, think tanks, and civil society stakeholders, we intend to create a novel research and training ecosystem that is built on a thought architecture that has a multidisciplinary outlook. While we are still discovering what interdisciplinarity means to us in our own individual research, uh, Shriti Ganguly and I, my colleague, we are co-leading a constellation under ideas called the Transitional Space, Culture, and Media Studies. This constellation brings together critical interdisciplinary theories and research focused on the interplay between socialization, space dynamics, new media, and the construction of everyday norms and cultural topologies. The panel discussion that we have today, the first one being feminism in the digital age, we'll discuss some of the key issues concerning our research group, feminism, and forming of youth identities and culture on social media. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome our audience. I would also like to welcome speakers for this morning, Nandini Thar. Nandini is an associate professor at the Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities and comes to JGU after an extensive teaching experience in both USA and India. She's interested in thinking of the emerging category of global Anglophone as it interacts with the non-Anglophone, particularly cultural productions in South Asian languages. She has an abiding interest in categories such as capital and neoliberal, and much of her work engages with the social categories which shape and transform how we write and what we write. She's recently published an edited volume with Routledge titled Contemporary Gender Formations in India. I've had the chance to read it. It's very interesting, and I would highly recommend that for everybody. And today we have her and some of her authors who have also contributed chapters to the book on the panel to speak about their work in this area. Next, we have Shramana. Shramana is a former colleague as well, but currently is a faculty at the Department of Psychology at Ashoka University. She's previously taught at the School of Human Studies at Ambedkar University and the School of International Studies at Symbiosis University. She's a social and political psychologist, primarily studying identity, violence, and intergroup relations. She was a Fulbright Narrows Fellow at the Hyatt School of Psychology at Clark University, and presently she's working on intergroup contact, prejudice, and identity performance in computer-mediated communication. I have read some of her book on gender, some of her papers on gender identities as they happen on social media, and also some on misinformation. So she has a very wide array of work, but today we will only focus on digital media shaping online identities. Debanjana Nayak is an assistant professor of English at Presidency University. She's also pursuing her PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her research focuses very diversely on digital storytelling, cyberfeminism, webcomics, graphic novels, and postcolonial media theory. Her writings have appeared in the Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics, Feminist Encounters, a Journal of Critical Studies in Culture and Politics, Critical Collective Colloquium, and several other edited volumes. She's also an author to the book that I previously mentioned, and we welcome her to the panel. And last but not the least, Shweta Kalani is also a professor of English literature at the SGTB Khalsa College at University of Delhi. She's also a PhD scholar and is currently focusing on the nexus between the literary, the affective, and the political with respect to digital narratives. Among her publications are co-edited anthology titled Imagining Worlds, Mapping Possibilities, Selected Science Fiction Stories, and several academic papers and book chapters, including Laughing Matters, a chapter on stand-up comedy, and enjoyment in late capitalism. As you will see, all our speakers come from very diverse backgrounds and also have a very broad array of body of work. But today, they have come together here on the common thread that they share, talking about from their perspective, disciplinary perspectives on digital feminism. So I'll hand it over to them, and we will have Nandini, Shramana, Devanjana and Shweta speak back to back a little about their foray of work, just to give the audience a brief idea of their perspectives and their literature, and that we'll follow that up with a few Q&A from both the audience and myself. So Nandini, I hand it over to you.
Thanks, Salome, and thanks all the other panelists. And I know that it's a Saturday morning, but we are here, and it seems like the beginning of the weekend might just be the best moment to talk about our world today and the intersections of something like feminist scholarship and politics. And I would just like to begin by saying that we live in an age when actually all kinds of feminist scholarships are in danger, right? Institutionally. So we need to kind of remember that as scholars, as we kind of go on to talk about things which have real resonances for the world we live in. So I would just begin to go into my presentation by having a brief discussion on what is digital age. So what we often term as digital age coincides with the emergence and consolidation of a specific form of capitalism, commonly identified as neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is characterized by the crisis, erosion, and the death of social institutions, which have often defined life within liberal capitalism, for example, parliamentary democracy, subsidized public sector, labor unions, and in case of for gendered lives and for feminist scholarship and activism, forums that address sexual harassment, right? And most of these institutions have been won after long struggles. And I'm not saying that these are perfect institutions, but these are institutions around which legal structures have been organized, that very discourse of rights have been organized. And I think that we are almost, a lot of us are seeing that how the structures don't hold together anymore within the very institutions we often work within, or the institutions in which we are forced to live our lives. And neoliberalism, if we are thinking about it in terms of a certain kind of feminist historiography, it is essentially post-feminist. And when I use the word post-feminist, I don't use it in the ideological sense of the term, but post-feminist as in the chronological sense of the term. So neoliberalism, as soon as it begins to consolidate yourself, it also has to think about how to manage the contradictions and demands raised through the feminist movements of at least 200 years, right? So as experienced in our everyday lives, neoliberalism is characterized by two parallel developments. the increasing number of middle-class women in the workforce, and a widening economic gap. And of course, these would have a lot of kind of complicated ramifications depending upon where we are in the globe. But I would, if I have to generalize, this is how what I would say becomes important for a lot of us who are trying to understand and grapple with gender and feminism right now. So the kinds of feminisms that take shape during this period often develop within the fissures of the dying institutions and institutions in crisis. So to that extent, what has been popularly known as quote unquote digital feminism develops within these contradictions, right? And of course, the proliferation of the digital means of expression lends an enormous amount of visibility to both certain forms of feminist and feminized cultural productions, discourses, narratives, and debates. And I would like to emphasize on the difference between feminist and feminized, because I do think in the digital age, we do hear a diversity of women's voices in the public space. However, we define it in multiple ways, and not all of them are feminist by any stretch of imagination, but they are there within the same space and often sharing spaces, common spaces with the feminists. So such circuits of visibility also often coexist with the actual material realities of shrinking institutional spaces for processes and institutions that were hard won through decades of feminist and other forms of right-based struggle, right? And I think most of us actually had to face, right, that either the erosion of the spaces, the bodies which would deal with sexual harassment in the public institutions we inhabit, or just working for and stepping into public institutions which do not have anything like in a CogSash or anything to deal with a kind of collective, give collective voice to the sexual harassment to begin with. And I think that to the extent we use the digital platforms to amplify the stories of sexual violence, of sexual harassment, we also have to deal on the other end with this non-existent or kind of dying institutions. So digital feminisms historically have often operated within representational circuits whose primary political project has often been to create an illusion of democracy. Furthermore, digital feminisms themselves have participated in creating, maintaining, and reinforcing such illusory performances of democracy. Digital feminisms have often been structurally set up to labor for the creation of everyday digital spectacles, and last but not the least, creation of such everyday digital spectacles have often come to be understood and interpreted as the primary modes of organizing and sustaining feminist thoughts, actions, debates, and movements, right? And of course, there is a political economic story to this everyday creation of digital spectacle. I'm not going to go into that, but it's also there. Now, undoubtedly, such digital spectacles have created an enormous archive of feminist texts and representations which exist for us to analyze, understand, and consider. And during the Q&A, I would also love to talk about that. What do these texts mean, right? As they kind of exist within this kind of digital archive, the digital space, and also what happens when actually these digital spaces are suspended because some corporation decides to kind of just take it all away, right? And I think that those of us are old enough to remember Orkut, right? That much of it's the kind of the predecessor of Facebook, and now it doesn't exist anymore. So what does actually feminist archiving mean in the digital age? And it is also true that digital archive of feminist texts have also disseminated feminist thought beyond the narrow confines of the college and university classrooms, elite intellectual circuits. And for those of us who work specifically within the subcontinental context, such digital feminist archives also exist in languages other than English. And the vernacular archives also testify to caste, class, and regional dimensions. So in a way, I think that we also have to, especially specifically when we talk about the emergence and history of digital feminisms in the subcontinent, in India, we have to be cognizant about the issue of language and how it intersects with other identity categories and gender. Yet, I would argue that we live in an age when the radical potential of the digital feminisms have been more or less exhausted. This is possibly evident in acute ways in the aftermath of the movement #MeToo, which had emerged during our times as one of the most influential digital feminist mobilizations. As the euphoria that MeToo had once generated dies down, we have to rethink the questions of its implications and ramifications. And I'm not talking about, that kind of misogynistic attack on MeToo or #AllMen. But what do we do with the kind of the questions that MeToo has thrown in front of us as feminists? As feminist scholars, writers, and activists, we are now left with the very unsexy task of thinking through the questions of the institutional and material gains of the movement. Additionally, we also have to think through the efficacy of the movemental strategy that MeToo mostly depended upon, which is name and shame, right? So I will conclude by saying that the current developments in the world, but also in India specifically, has proved that naming and shaming is an inadequate strategy to deal with the issues of sexual harassment and violence to begin with. And of course, when we work within microspaces like colleges and universities and NGOs, we are familiar with that specter. But I think nationally, it comes down to us in a very, very conspicuous manner in two cases. One is Bilkis Bano and another one is the women wrestlers movement, right? And both of these instances have evolved more or less outside of the paradigms of digital feminism, although the latter have also used the digital forums and platforms extensively. What makes these two instances reside out of the paradigms of the #MeToo are two things. One, the persistent rallying within the judicial processes and institutions. And two, in case of the latter, actual physical protests that require movement and assembly of bodies in real time and space. Consequently, right now, one needs to ask, how does one insert the body, the materialities of space, and collective assemblies within the digital representational spaces of the #MeToo and, of course, other kinds of digital feminist movements? One also needs to ask, without collective material mobilizations and persistent organizing that moves beyond the digital, what does the digital, and for me as a literary scholar, the textual, right? So the digital is also the textual naming of the perpetrator is trying to achieve. And I do talk about that a little bit in the way I understand it in the book. In other words, if I go back to where I began this presentation, the digital creates an illusion of the democracy, right? So can we say then that digital feminisms, possibly most successfully exemplified in the #MeToo movement, creates an illusion of feminist mobilization? And in doing so, also creates an essential politics of feminist demobilization, which replaces an earlier era's emphasis on building up actual viable organizations, persistent engagement with institutions, sometimes with the aim of transforming them and sometimes with the aim of dismantling them. And I think that as we speak, we also have to remember that what is happening with the kind of the student encampments in the US universities, European universities, right? That there is, and also the anti-abortion movement in US, that we are going back to the era, I mean, of course, not in the same kind of a way, of spectacular feminist mobilizations in the street, spectacular alliances and of bodies that identify as feminist youth students. So in a way, I think that we have to kind of rethink the last 10 years of history of digital feminism and what it has meant politically for us in a critical kind of a way without getting into binaries, without dismissing its contribution in actually making women's participation in feminist politics, in other kinds of politics, visible within the public spaces. I would end here, and I mean, of course, it's a kind of a general presentation where I throw out lots of larger kind of understandings and realizations and ideas. I would be more than happy to talk more about kind of the examples I have in mind and the complexities and contradictions that I'm referring to during the Q&A. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to listening to the other panelists.
Thank you, Nandini. Shamna, do you mind taking over now?
Thank you, Poulomi. I have a few slides, so I'll just see if I can share my screen. Is that visible? And on slide share, right? Okay. Okay, so good morning, everybody. And firstly, thank you very much for asking me to join this wonderful panel to talk about something that we're all interested in. I think what makes this panel already, to me, it seems quite interesting is because it's truly interdisciplinary, Poulomi. So congratulations. I think the coming of, I mean, when I was listening to Nandini, I felt that there were strands which overlapped, but because we come from different disciplinary approaches, I think that kind of would be interesting to explore. So as you know, was mentioned in my introduction, I'm primarily a social psychologist. So when I got interested in looking at digital media, so generally identity in the digital space, there was, and you know, this was a few years back. So there's already a change in the kind of understanding that within, I would say, social political psychology, the understanding of what identity, and when I say identity, I'm particularly talking about collective or social identity. So anything from gender to ethnicity to to nationality. So you know, we are interested in collective identities. So what is the intersection or overlap between such identities, and how does it play out in the digital space? So we've seen a shift in that scholarship. So I'll just start with that because that really gives sort of support to, I think, what we have found specific to our work on this. So when we started, we just wanted to ask a simple question that does identity matter online? And the reason we were doing it, asking this, was because older literature, basically, when it was looking at digital media, or what we call as computer mediated communication, or that space generally, basically said that there was a lot of hope and a lot of positivity about what the internet can offer. And that was primarily because we could be anybody online. So it was as if your identity could be diffuse, you could be somebody else, it really didn't matter. And with that, a lot of scholars basically said that, there was a sort of an equalization, right? Because because I was not visible to you, and because you were not visible to me, and I could be visible as anybody else in the form of an image that I choose to be. So we are talking about online games, we are talking about chat rooms, we're talking about anything. So identity really didn't matter. So from there, as a social psychologist, I think our interest was, when we were looking at this question was, so does identity matter, and does our social identity, so something like gender, does it really matter? Is there a space for gender identity online. And things that make us social, right? So markers of social identity, markers of gender, which could be, as we know, it doesn't always have to be physical. It could be names. It could be several things, right? So because we can play around with that, I can choose to name myself anything. Sometimes in several chat rooms, we just use like numbers, right? So does it really matter who I am? And what actually how literature has also evolved, interestingly, within social psychology, is to say that actually, contrary to what we were thinking about in the early 2000s, compared to that in the last decade, I would say, and especially after the coming of social media, we have seen increasingly that social identities really matter. And today, when we talk about several things from polarization and all of this that's happening, much of which is through the intersection of social media and all of that, we can say that there's some theorization which says that in fact it is this element of not being personally visible. So it's almost as if sometimes that your individual identity matters less, because you can be who you are and you're not really always revealing yourself as to who I am. I might not reveal my name, I might not reveal how I look, and so on and so forth. But I can choose to be, both consciously as well as automatically, as we say, parts of conversation we can choose to identify, we can choose to mobilize, we can choose to defend what we feel a part of. And that is why we actually see that there's a lot of social identity-based mobilizations, social identity-based discourses that we see online. So our work kind of sort of took off from that. And the next question that we were interested in was also that, okay, so if social identity matters, then what we see around gender and gender norms, and feminist discourse being one of that. So how I understand my identity, how I perform my identity, how I mobilize, around that identity. So what we see about that online is that different from traditional feminist narratives and discourses. And this kind of took us towards the specific, work that I'll be talking about today. And interestingly, we found some existing work which said that actually, contrary to, again, because again, there had been literature, we were just, like I said, in the last decade, discovering this entire overlap between face-to-face and virtual media and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of contradictory but really insightful findings from a lot of research. And while some of it said that essentially the very space of virtual media where there is anonymity, there's invisibility, there's, gender switching, I can actually assert in a way that especially for disadvantaged groups. So a lot of more participation for women and things like that, that what is happening in terms of identity performance is fundamentally different from what we have been able to achieve offline for so long, right? But on the contrary, there were others who said that, no, it's actually not so exclusive, right? So it's not that virtual media specifically something is happening, even though, when, like Nandini was saying, when Me Too was able to reach the kind of breadth that it did, a lot of people started saying that this was only possible because it was a social media facilitated movement, right? And maybe that's partly true, but it is also, what we have found is that it's actually a continuous communication loop, which basically means that what we see happening online is not essentially different from the kind of discourses within feminism as well as anti-feminism, and I'll talk about that we have actually seen traditionally exist. So we kind of see these languages, these discourses, these narratives, these norms being transported from traditional spaces to online, and then something else emerging from that online space, which again goes back to how we then think or feel offline. And that primarily happens through language, I would say, because the work that we did was also on discourse analysis. So we were interested in discourses specifically. And the kind of language that emerges from these online spaces around feminism, anti-feminism, masculinity, and so on and so forth, is also not just restricted to online discourses now. It's not just something that you're using. So things like hashtags, a lot of the words that for especially, specific generation of young users, social media users, are using in their day-to-day language, those have actually emerged from online spaces. So that language has now become part of how you relate to your gender identity and how you perform it day to day. So it's not just online anymore. So I'll be presenting just a little bit on what we found from the original paper. I'll sort of attach that. I think I have it in one of the slides later. But like I said, I mean, before going into the findings, that we looked at Facebook public forums where discussions were around contested topics around gender identity, particularly around feminism, and how how these social media users, Indian users, were understanding different aspects of feminism. And some things, I've just picked out a few things to kind of add as example. And one was that there were many definitions. And I think this goes back to what Nandini was saying, which is why I was nodding very sort of, I really got that point, because one thing we see is that there is like I was saying, again, the ideas of what traditional feminism is, or what we've understood it ideologically, there is a transportation of that to the online space. But because of what digital space represents, there is a bifurcation. There's like a scattering of what these feminist identities mean and what it is. And we can choose to, according to our participants, the kind of data, the kind of conversations that we were looking at, they were all referring to it as still as feminists. So that was interesting. But, if we take a step back and look at it, we could definitely see that some of it may not even be sort of feminist discourses, but feminization may be or something else. But there were many definitions of feminists. And some of these, both the feminist, and when I say feminist, there's also anti-feminist. There's always those two sides. So some of these are simply replicating ideas of the negative connotations to a feminist, which have existed traditionally, right? So these aspects of being a gold digger, or being somebody who is not a mother, or not holding a traditional social role, right? So when we were looking at these conversations, a lot of the attacks on, and this was again between men and women who self-identified, we didn't know because these were social media conversations. So they would say that I'm a man or I'm a woman and so on and so forth. But a lot of this back and forth, largely the anti-feminist discourses came from men, but it was not always men. It was also women, right? And a lot of this separation of, okay, I'm not a feminist because I would love to cook in the kitchen, or I would love to be a mother, was always women. And this is not fundamentally different from what we have seen traditionally. It's just maybe using some new terms, right, which maybe we are not familiar with. And that was really interesting. And sometimes it was even age-old terms like gold digger, right, which is like there for so long. But there was also this, in these many definitions of feminists, this was also these terms which, even though within literature, within academic literature, I would say it may have existed for longer, but in daily discourse, we see less use of it. For instance, things like pseudo-feminist or choice feminism. And there was a lot of use of these terms, which basically meant that, oh, you say you're a feminist, but you only choose the kind of, where to perform your feminism. So there was this also countering of who a feminist is. And if you're a feminist, you should support several things and so on and so forth. Interestingly, there's also this term of feminazi. And these are some quotes from our study. So if you read, it'll be quite clear, right? So if women like you and the feminazis here are incompetent to be a mother, then, don't do that. So that's the thing. And so on the one hand, we see age-old terms being sort of re-emerging in online debates and discourses, but we also see these newer terms, which I would say have become more and more common because of their now sort of emergence on online spaces. So things like feminazi or pseudo-feminists are used very regularly, right? And again, what they mean, what they represent, it's a bifurcated definition. It could be anything and everything. The second thing that I would like to quickly talk about is this thing that emerged from these analysis, and I have since then been very interested in, because I think to really understand digital feminism, one really also really take a look at what's happening in the manosphere, as it's called. And what this is, of course, I mean, now I think maybe most of us are familiar with this, but again, similarly existing traditional idea of threatened masculinity, but kind of getting a new voice, a new almost ideological definition online, given the kind of representation, given the kind of cross-border communities that have actually emerged online, which represent these kind of narratives. And these were very, there are various different groups, men going their own way is that MGTOW. Of course, incel is a much more sort of extremist group, similarly, sort of related to this anti-women, misogynistic discourse of what feminism is doing to men. And again, these were some of the, and it's important to remember that we only looked at Indian social media users. So there was also this idea, for instance, with inceldom, which was largely sort of American and things like that. But some of our recent work, what we have seen is a lot of this manosphere activity can be seen across the global south, as we say, or non sort of American context as well. It's very much present and very much actively there in discourses online in several different countries. I mean, India, Pakistan, Brazil. Some of my colleagues say that there's been sort of interesting work looking at this in Korea, for instance, South Korea, and so on and so forth. So, and I just wanted to share this really nice quote that was published in Unheard, a couple of years back, which I thought was, which really captures what a lot of which has been facilitated by the digital space, and how gender narratives and norms and discourses around gender, for instance, have evolved, transformed, been co-opted sometimes on the digital space, and has left. Sometimes it's interesting to think that in the last decade or so, a lot of ideas through feminism have kind of received certain changed and transformed social roles or goals. But it's also, on the other hand, left a space for young men where they're not really sure what the social script for them is. And we know about Andrew Tate and several other such extremely misogynistic, very, very popular influencers, as they say, who also have these large following online. So that's also something to remember within these discourses. So just concluding thoughts. Traditional as well as novel terms that refer to these descriptive meanings of what gender is. So the first thing we know is that it matters online. It's, whether sometimes we are choosing to perform it in a very conscious and thoughtful way. Sometimes it's not even that. It's really appraised because social identities matter. It's appraised automatically. It's appraised when it's challenged. It's appraised when you feel solidarity, right? That's what we saw in Me Too. You just come out of your own because it's important, right? Both positive identity assertions, that's also important, that, where this ability to actually say that, for instance, I'm a woman, or if I'm, whatever identity that is that you're asserting, and to say that this is what we think, sometimes that space hasn't existed, but we also see a lot of sort of polarization, as I was saying, but also flaming. Flaming is that kind of bringing of all those old, really violent, often sexualized, humiliations, and giving them a new name online, right? So whether it's feminazi, whether it's simp, that's another word that is used for men who are feminized in a way, right? New discourses that are born out of digital spaces and interact, and they extend beyond that. That's the main thing, that these terms, right, these pseudo feminists or simp or things like that, these often started gaining popularity as hashtags or things like that. Even incel, we would see women just throwing around, oh, you're an incel, you're an incel, but that's become common language from online. It's an online community actually. So I would, that's the paper. I mean, I'll be happy to share the link, and thank you so much. I'll be happy to discuss more during the Q&A.
Thank you, Shramana. In fact, there is a ongoing gender and conversation happening on social media about bear and men in the woods. So that is something that we will talk about in our discussion. But before that, I think we have laid a good foundational grounds coming from Nandini's very critical perspective, and your conversation bringing in men and how they experience feminism online as well. So moving on, I would like to hand it over to Debanjana, if you would like to go ahead with your speech.
Yes, I'll just share my PPT once.
Are you able to share your screen?
Yeah, so I'll just see if I'm trying to do this one. So is it visible?
Yeah, I can see.
Okay, so if I change it, do you see this screen, same screen?
Yes, the slot work. Yeah, yes.
Oh, no,
we
no.
do.
I think okay. So so I think it is sharing the entire screen, but the PPT is visible right now, right?
Yes, yes.
So that's it. Okay. So hello everyone, good morning. And I think we already have a very good discussion beginning with Nandini and then Shramana. And the more I was listening to them, and the more I could, look at my work being, in context to this, diverse discussion that we are having from, we're coming from an array of background, but the crux of it, the kind of discussion we are having is quite similar, and quite there at the convergent point, because see, I will be talking about liberation, and if there is any liberation, if there is any true empowerment in the digital space, or is this a selective outrage? Now, that is how I look at the cyberspace, as it has it has a tendency to filter down voices, and kind of a the reflection of real life as well, and reinforcing the power structures of our world around us, with, like Shomana was talking about, identities being created in the real world that getting reinforced. Or is there really any empowering voice at all in this neoliberal era, in this digital space, with the new digital tools, as well as the hashtag activism? So I'm bringing all that into perspective, while also combining my own, understanding and study of feminism, where, I'm looking at cyber feminist theories. So it is, no, I am at the middle point of theorization and praxis, what we are actually doing, and how we have, over a period of time, in fact, for years, as feminists, as scholars, as activists, as consumers, we have understood activism, we have understood gender-based problems, and how we have walked that path. So to begin that entire discussion, I would just refer to this absolutely amazing work that a group of women from Adelaide did in 1991, which was they called it a cyber feminist manifesto for the 21st century. So this is something they did. So they put up billboards, they put up hoardings, and a lot of creative works which were public installations in the public space. But what it did is, again, bringing together theory and praxis, something that was theorized by Donna Haraway and Sadie Plant, the things that they have said that, very hopeful ideas of bringing in technology and feminist empowerment and that kind of a liberation. They started trying to realize it in real life, through their works, through their creativity. And while it happened in 1991, and why am I referring to this is because when we look at India today, we are actually in the middle of a lot of activism, including feminist activism. And this started off roughly after the Nirbhaya movement in 2012. So we can think of that time as this, the surge of feminism, as this, period when it emerged very significantly with a lot of force. But was it not there even before that? So we have, in 2009, if you remember, there was this Pink Chaddi movement, Pink Chaddi campaign, actually, which revolted against slut shaming, it came up from Mangalore, and it talked about this curfew culture for women, how they should dress, at what time they should come back home, they should not go to pubs. So it emerged out of this resistance against one culture of thinking of women as sluts if they go to a pub, if they wear certain kind of dresses, if they are walking down an alley at night. But that campaign was a very street-based campaign. It was a protest that happened in a localized area. It definitely had this hashtag Pink Chaddi, but it did not put up that kind of a surge. It definitely located the feminist movement in the map of today's era of digital feminism, but it did not gain that kind of a momentum. So I am looking at this, two opposing stances on Indian cyber feminism and from both theory and praxis. So on the one hand, you have we all have this how we can look at cyber feminism or this digital activism. Is it all null and void? Is it all all a sham? There is nothing real to it, or is it there is again this selection that is there, filtering down of voices? We have, say, for example, Slut Walk, or even with the Black History Month coming in and influencing us in our culture of resistance, culture of protest. So in that way, in certain cases, we have this transnational feminist connectivity or activism that trickles down from the West. But as I've said, this particular term, trickle-down feminism, is something which we have to look at it from the angle that we live in a capitalist world. And when we get influenced by the West, it is also our own, I look at the cyberspace in that way, that there is two kinds of hegemony. One is the colonial hegemony, where we always look forward to the West, how they are most essentially America, how they are leading their movements, if there is one movement in their university campus, we want to replicate that in our campus. So that is probably in our very post-colonial identity, we tend to incline towards that kind of a movement where the cyberspace kind of gets dominated by this colonial hegemony. It's kind of a cyber colonial hegemony. And on the other hand, we also have this, on the other hand, we just, in the Indian context as well, if we think of what is this class of woman, what is this caste? or what is this other social identities or markers of women who come to come on the internet. It can be a personal blog, it can be in social media, and share their experiences or give an opinion. And if they do, are they the spokesperson of everyone in that community? So in that way, is it the opposing stance to this first point would be, is this reinforcing that existing power structure that we already have in the society? This white, heterosexual, masculine culture, then cultural hierarchy. So because on the one hand, if we have this one of the highest internet penetration in the world, on the other hand, we also have people who cannot have that access to internet, cannot have that access to a good phone, or cannot really articulate their words very well to go on to the digital space and voice out their opinion. So the question that I'm essentially raising is, if we think of the digital space, it can be something like X or Facebook or even Instagram videos or TikTok videos, where you have videos in the form of a kind of, you can also say, cultural representation. Now, some of them are laughed at, some of them are hugely appreciated. And as Shromana was also talking about, this influencer culture that is there. So even there, if we think on the one hand, if we have a very strong feminist movement with #MeToo, #AintNoCinderella, #SlutWalk. On the other hand, we tend to laugh at things which do not coincide with our own experiences, right? So on the one hand, we think of the digital space as a shared experience. When there is a name and shame movement on the basis of this sexual predatorship or sexual abuse, or a voice against rape culture, or making the university campus a safe space. On the other hand, are all the students, or all the students of all kinds of colleges, all kinds of universities, get an equal share of that focus, that attention that digital space has to offer? Now, I come to this question with an experience of teaching in actually two spaces. One is when I'm just today I'm teaching at a university which is at the heart of the city, and before this, I have taught in colleges which are not at the heart, which are in some remote villages, which are in town. So in those areas, when I went there as a professor or as teacher, I have done some of my volunteering teaching as well. It is rarely that even if they have if they do not have an iPhone, but that is also a kind of digital divide that is there. But even if they have a phone, even if they have some kind of phone, some kind of access to internet, is their language coinciding with the language, or reflecting, or appropriate for the internet? Is it gaining enough attention? Language being a very important point where we can understand how our shared experiences also get divided. So if the language does not relate to ours, if the language does not relate to that majority section, we tend to laugh at it. We tend to find the grammatical mistakes of it. Even if there is a video, we tend to laugh at it about how ludicrous it is, how ridiculous it is, how it is funny in a way that it does not relate to my experience. So in that way, with us being the consumers of this internet, with the consumers of social media, on the other hand, we are also activists on social media with #activism and everything. We still tend to filter out those voices which do not reflect our own. So where is this shared experience? The lived experience or the shared experience that we have in the digital space, in the cyberspace, isn't it quite also founded on this notion of relatability, of familiarity, and hence the point of internet penetration? So even if there is an internet, even if there is a phone, is there that language? Are there those, I think, there are certain kind of terms and phrases that Nandini and Shomana, they both were referring to. So those terms and phrases, if we think of quote unquote in style or feminazi or and I will get to some more terms actually. They are quote unquote cool. They are quote unquote very urban. But when there is a experience sharing in a language or with terms or with kind of a linguistic capability of of someone who is already marginalized in the society, how much is that accepted in the digital space? That is something we can think of as a kind of hindrance that can be there in in this when we think of feminism to be surging, to be like a force of nature on the internet, we have to really think of what are the voices we are hearing. Even if you think of the Me Too name and shame movements, what are the campuses, university campuses that you have heard those names from? And I'm not, and in no way I'm criticizing or condemning any of those efforts, but just to put it in focus that there is also a power structure in it. There is also a kind of filtering down, trickle down feminism, which is already a problem in the social reality in our own power structures of any university, any college campus. That power structure is present, equally present, and at times it is reinforced, it is strengthened, it is amplified because of the digital tools, because of someone has, say, an iPhone, or someone does not even have a proper phone to type out their experiences. So even a basic difference of digital tools can create a very huge gap between sharing of experiences, gaining that activism or the fruits of that activism in the digital space. So while everyone is on media, social media or or electronic media, everyone's story can be, you can say you have this infinite space to share your story. No one is asking you to stop. No one is asking you, no one is a gatekeeper here. Even when there is a concept like that, on the other hand, we as a society with our ideas of linguistic capabilities, even with the ideas of, I'll say, as simple as a grammar. So if there is an error in grammar, if there's a grammatical mistake, if there is the sentence structure is not right, the syntax is not right, it does not coincide with my aesthetics, it's anyway a rejection is there. That is the trickle-down feminism that I think is there in the digital space as well. And when we come to hashtag activism, there as well, on the one hand, since I have, I'm also a scholar of visual studies. I look at graphic narrations and digital storytelling. So I look at a lot of, it can be graphic narratives in the form of webcomics. It can be in the form of memes. It can also be GIFs or videos. But in all of those, if you see, on the one hand, there are a lot of creative efforts, subversive efforts, where one wants to create one's own, work of art, masterpiece, whatever it is, and with the idea that I'm going against a mainstream culture, I'm going against a mainstream media. What no one is showing, what no news channel is broadcasting, I will do that through maybe Instagram or through social media or through some videos. It can be, the real world issues can seep into the subversive and creative acts, and can also, be definitely merged with hashtag activism, because, this is also the performance that is being done. It is not just, words which are being shared or experiences in the form of description, but also these videos which are shared, creative efforts which are being put on there, out there for the larger audience through hashtag, through performance, both. On the other hand, there is also this, what I called beyond digital divide, beyond that access to internet or digital tools. There is also this visibility that is important here, because even if we think of the 2012 movement after the Nirbhaya episode, that, the whole resistance and protest against rape culture that happened, did not really materialize for someone like Jisha, did not materialize for someone like Soni Sori, who got tortured and abused in 2011 in Chhattisgarh, as an Adivasi woman who was also an activist, who was also a very vocal person. She was not someone who was shy and demure and could not really voice out. She was this activist already, and she was tortured as an as a woman and also as a political activist. So she was tortured, she was abused, but she got heard, and literally quote unquote heard, or she got this whole focus on her story came into light in 2014 when she came to Delhi and participated in this mainstream political milieu, and faced news channels which were at the heart of Delhi, at the heart of the capital city, and aligned her politics to somewhat to that hegemonic mainstream politics. And when that happened, we heard about Soni Sori. We started talking about Soni Sori, the abuse that she has faced, and how she should fight this whole struggle of hers. And I was writing this chapter for Nandini in the in I think 2018, 19. So over the years I have written and rewritten the chapter. When I was writing it in 2000, or conceptualized it in 2017, I guess, in 2016, 17, I was just conceptualizing the chapter. I was not really writing that down. And I was trying to find materials. There were a lot of voices that was raised for Soni Sori. That was, Soni Sori's story was there on the internet. It was, everyone knew about it. But right now in 2024, if you go and do a bit of a search about Adivasi activists who got tortured, not just Soni Sori, but after them, or there is Bhima Koregaon, there is other activists who get imprisoned time and again. And how much is that? How much is the momentum? How much are the hashtags there in the cyberspace? This is this is the question that we must ask ourselves. So, for example, the case of Jisha, or there are other Dalit women who got raped and abused. The Hathras case, for example, some of them got the attention because of the real life struggle that was done on the street during that time, and very particularly for the Hathras case, because someone captured the moment when the body was burned down, all the documents are being burned down. So that moment was something that gave rise to some bit of attention for the Hathras victim in the digital space. But without that, can there be really any digital liberation for a woman from the marginalized class and caste, or any social identity which is marginalized, which is oppressed? So in that way, we cannot celebrate the internet as this ultimate liberatory experience for every woman, or even gender. So gender empowerment or woman empowerment cannot be guaranteed with the internet or the digital space. In fact, what is important as feminist scholars and activists for us right now is, as I think I remember Nandini saying that all feminists from all discourses are under some kind of a threat right now. True. And we have to really find out how we are also going to we are also filtering down certain voices. We are also defining our feminism in certain ways. Taking up from, I think, Shomona's discussion also, that you have several definitions for a feminist. So these definitions that come up, that can be in the as anti-feminist words like feminazi, or like too much of a kind of threatening kind of a feminism that is portrayed in the digital space. On the other hand, there is also a definition of feminism that can be focused on, is the kind of co-optation that the capitalist culture does. If you think of the internet space, instead of looking at the stories of Jisha or Soni Sori or the other Dalit women who have been abused and who's probably sharing their experiences, but we are not focusing it on enough, we have certain kind of a co-optation that is being done by a capitalist structure in the internet, in the digital space. Like, for example, there are terms like boss girl or boss woman, sigma, and these are the terms, if you find that I have in my study, I have found out that you see these terms, they are mostly associated with some products. It can be a, it can be a meme, it can be a video, it can be something. So a product like, for example, I will just try to remind you of all these advertisements. There was this Santur advertisement, or there is this advertisements for soaps and perfumes, where an empowered woman is the one who is never smelly, she's never sweaty, she is going to the office, handling her household chores, and yet so powerful, yet so prominent in both the public and the private space, and equally strong. So that kind of a narrative just gets transported to the digital space in the form of this boss girl, boss woman, sigma woman who can do everything, who is like superhuman. And these narratives which were already there, we are just molding it in a new light with more urban cool language and linguistic devices, and presenting it in the cyberspace. Are we doing anything beyond that? So the visibility that we have in the cyberspace right now also has this power structures, and leading to the from the visibility to the next discussion would be slacktivism, where you have a hashtag for some time. So it is for some time that you have, say, the hashtag of Nirbhaya, or the hashtag of Soni Sori, or the hashtag of Ain't No Cinderella, or Pink Chaddi, or even Slut Walk. It does not, it just once a year, or even for, from feminism, even if we go to a gender hashtag, there's Pride Month happens in just 1 month, when all kind of commercial corporate companies will come up with their own products, advertise that in their own way with this mode. So it is not just, it is, as feminist scholars and activists, while we are trying to find this, space where we can locate our resistance in the digital world, we have to also look at the power structures which want to co-opt these resistances in their own way, with their own terminologies, phrases. So while there was kind of hashtag Slut Walk, or hashtag Pride Month, or hashtag something like Me Too also, or Ain't No Cinderella, they all have been used in some way or the other to make things more commercialized. And the moment it happens, the moment all this marginalization that was already there get reinforced, get more prominent, and there I come to this last point, where I look at ephemerality. So ephemerality is also, while there is visibility to some extent, ephemerality is just going out very quickly. It's just fizzling out very quickly. And here I definitely, in my work, I put out 2 different cases. The Nirbhaya case, which did not become ephemeral. It stayed in the cyberspace. It stayed in our consciousness. It stayed in documentaries of several mainstream media for a long period of time. Even today we remember it. But for Soni Sori or Jisha or other Dalit women victims, there is hardly that space that we find, or hardly that discussion that is long lasting, discussion that will have a long lasting impact in real life. And I'll just quickly go to this last section of my discussion, where I look at activism or cyberfeminism from a very broad perspective, and I give out these 3 brilliant initiatives by and which I think brings together many sections of the society. So one is Anti-Love Caste Project by Jyotsna Siddharth, who looks at not just caste but also gender, and looks at relationships, how it is not just social identity which matters, but also now you have this kind of a cultural resistance that you have to do. So so there is this idea of quote unquote jihadi love, or the Islamophobia that comes out with when there is this kind of a you find a relationship of Hindu-Muslim relationship in the form of marriage, or any kind of loving relationship. But when you have the project she did, Anti-Love Caste, did not just talk about relationships, did not just talk about caste. It also brought into focus women who were marginalized, who could not marry out of their caste, who could not marry out of their religious identity. So a project like that, a kind of resistance like that, takes into account this intersection of gender, caste, class, memory, and relationships. Memory here is through these two other brilliant ventures that we have. One is the hashtag Dalit Women Fight. Now that is also a hashtag activism, and this is by Thanmazhi Sundarajan, who initiated this hashtag, but it did not just definitely limit to her. It went out and expanded to many other women, and did not just put into focus the experiences of contemporary women. It also brought into our attention, brought into the light the many struggles of women throughout history who were Dalits, who were marginalized. So this is the memory that is important. This is the documentation that is important. So however ephemeral, however filtered visibility women or marginalized women might have in the digital space, projects or constant hashtags like that, like this kind of this kind of initiatives bring bring into light the feminist concerns, as well as other concerns which coincide with feminist concerns, like caste, like class, like relationships, and many other the things of quotidian life, the things that we do not discuss generally. Even those can come into focus for with these ventures. And finally, we have the Dalit History Month, and as you can see, the two very kind of posters that I have shown here. The one on the top is Dalit Women Fight hashtag, and the one below is Dalit History Month. Now, Dalit History Month happens in April to commemorate the lives and struggles of Dalits, and to understand their struggle better, to have a history of their own, to have an archive of their own. But through this initiative, we have a number of Dalit women coming up as their names, their struggles coming up, and merging with our understanding of the of today's world. So the historical figures, the political figures that we know from the mainstream media, from hegemony, or from a dominant culture, get subverted to some extent if we constantly understand, dig out, read about women and people who have a history of feminist activities, a history of Dalit activism, and all of them are also anti-class activism. So all these activisms, at one point of time, it has to come together, merge together, and bring out a stronger version of cyber feminism. So to conclude all of these discussions, which can, I think, prolong in the question and answer round, that cyber feminism cannot be sustainable. It cannot sustain on its own as a standalone activism. There has to be, like we have intersectional activism in real world, there has to be activism which takes into account gender, caste, class, but the two other that I point out, memory and relationship, they are equally important to put forward the concerns of gender, caste, and class. It is important to document, it is important to archive, and it is important to even look at relationships, particularly in a time where relationships also have this political identifiers. You can identify who's who, what is the caste identity, what is the religious identity, who should be with whom, if there can be a live-in relationship, if there should be a marriage between two people from different cultural, religious backgrounds. So when we have these discussions within the scope of feminism, then only we can have a really sustained form of cyber feminism. Otherwise, it is going to be ephemeral and it is going to have limited visibility. So thank you. I will just wrap up my discussion till here, and the rest I have written in the chapter in Nandini's book, and I am happy to discuss anything that you know we can in that question answer round. So thank you, and I just.
Thank you, Debanjana. And I have some questions for you that maybe you could take up in the moderation round. I'll message them, but because we're running a bit late, I'll move on to Shweta. Shweta, you have the floor.
Right, thanks. I'll just share my screen and just let me know if it's. Is my screen visible?
It is, but we are only able to see part of it.
Okay. Part of it as in you can't see the entire thing. I mean, you can't see the entire screen. Is that how it is?
I think it is like half at the bottom.
Okay. Let me try it again. Just a minute. Is it better now?
Yeah, we can see it.
Wonderful. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Pauline, and thank you, of course, to Ideas for inviting me and allowing me to share a small part of what I've been working on. So my presentation is actually titled Network Intimacies, Feminisms in the Digital Age. And it's great, actually, that I was able to listen to all the others before me because it kind of lays down the background for what I'll be talking about. I largely would like to stay clear of the debate that's sort of been discussed in the earlier presentations about the celebratory or the critical attitude towards cyberfeminism of a certain sort, and perhaps focus more on how certain kinds of communication are established, what kind of communication networks are established in digital activism. So as I like to start by this sort of primer about the shift from physical to online activism. It's something that I've discussed in the book at the chapter at great length, but I'll just sort of gleam over it right now. So social media, of course, first came to light during the Arab Spring movement of 2011 when it was used to orchestrate physical protests. Now, again, there was a lot of debate about the role and the significance of social media in such protests. But at that point of time, it was mostly used to mobilize masses and perhaps broadcast what was happening in these parts of the world globally, internationally. What I'm more interested in looking at is how existing networks of communication are reshaped by social media networks, especially in the case of activism. And how does, more significantly, then how does the materiality of social media, the kind of algorithmic structures, the affordances, what they allow users to do, how does that impact the forms and modalities of communicative action? And finally, then how are individual and collective identities formed and established in cyberspace? These are some of the questions that I want to look at in my presentation. I will be doing this primarily through looking at poetry and how it's shared in online spaces, because that is my area of interest. But before that, like I said, what are the modalities and sort of the vocabulary of dissent? How does it change in social media? I would like to attribute some of it, at least, to the affordances of social media. And by that, I mean certain ways of sharing, certain ways of expression, certain ways of communication that are made possible by the social media platforms. And again, these are different for different platforms. So they give rise to new modalities and vocabularies of expressing this dissent. For instance, the one example that's been spoken about, I think, across all presentations today is that of the hashtag. Now, the logic of the hashtag, the kind of additive logic of the hashtag, by which means it's always already incomplete in a certain way. It's a primer to which you can add your experiences, you can simply share it, like it, reshare it, whatever else. So it becomes like a body, ever expanding, ever changing, very fluid body of personal opinions or experiences, wherein there is already a sort of prescribed framework within which you can add or simply subscribe to a certain idea or a certain idea. Digital feminisms also, as other people have also spoken about, there are, of course, new logics of visibility. Sometimes they can be quite debilitating in terms of how algorithms work. So there is obviously that shadow that looms large. There is no denying it, the shadow of the workings of these platforms that are now owned, of course, by large multinational corporations. What becomes visible to you, what doesn't become visible to you is sometimes not in your hands. And that's kind of a setback that we work with while we study such platforms. But what I want to focus on is how the kind of physical intimacy, perhaps, which was a product of people coming together tangibly in material spaces, in otherwise physical forms of protest, how is that transformed when it comes to digital spaces, which of course lack the kind of embodiment that you would associate with um, online spaces that lack the kind of embodiment that you would associate with physical places. Here, I would like to bring in the concept of what is affective publics or digital affect cultures, which are sustained, I argue, by cultures of feeling, of sentiment, of how people are moved by certain things, either to reshare them or to add to it in certain way. And I do this since, like many others, I'm also come from a literary background. I do this by looking at how poetry circulates.
This is, of course, a body of poetry that's known as Insta poetry. It has been discussed, maligned, everything. The literary merit or the lack of it has been an issue of great interest. Again, I like to stay clear of that because that is another, that's a debate that can last for hours, perhaps. But what I do look at is how the supposedly feminist rhetoric that is articulated in such poems is done through a certain modality of expression. So, for instance, you will see that these poems are often short. They are meant to fit into the boxes of Instagram. They are very simple, very accessible things. Like I said, characteristics that have been attacked when it comes to discussing their lack of literary merit. You will also see that they're often accompanied by a visual along with the poem. And this visual, in the examples that I have chosen here, you'll see that this visual here has the female body or the anatomy of the female body in some form or the other. Now, if you look at these poems, you will see that they are, sorry, just give me a minute. Yeah, if you look at these poems, you'll see that there's a prevalence of the first person I, the imagined listener, that is you, and we or they. So very sort of generic identities that are established in the writing of this poetry. Now we have to remember that this poetry is often designed for conscious circulation in online spaces. So it originates, it's digital born, if you want to use that term. A lot of it originated in cyberspace. It was designed for production and circulation in cyberspace, consumption in cyberspace. And later, of course, some of them have gone on to sort of publish physical collections of poetry, but that came later, right? Now, I want to argue that the prevalence of the generic I, the we, and the they in such poetry allows the speaker of the poetry to enter into conversation with the unknown other, which is, of course, users, readers across the world, across the globe. And this is also a process that is facilitated, that is materialized by the algorithmic operations of social media, right? So as the poem travels freely in social media on the internet, then it's able to find users, much like a hashtag, yeah? And this process is, of course, aided by, which is the algorithmic operations, which the purpose of which, again, is to find more users, right? So these forms of circulation, which are unique to social media, allow sharing, commenting on, reposting, and all of these endemic practices, which are built into the very materiality of social media networks, allow people to share or express certain ideas, even when they might not have the vocabulary to do so. So, they might not be well equipped in a certain kind of language, as has been pointed out by others before me, but the kind of affordances that are built into these networks will just allow you to share them, repost them, maybe add an emoticon to them or something like that. But by doing that, you become part of a certain body of experiences, ideas, opinions, whatever else. And what this promotes is a certain endless sense of play as poems travel freely through through social media. So they're always, like I'm saying, it's like the hashtag, it's always already incomplete. It's this rhizomatic structure, for instance, that becomes a part of how these poems are read, how these poems acquire meaning, and more importantly, how these poems influence emotionally and sentimentally their readers. So like I said, while we can sort of endlessly debate about whether they are literary enough or not, or whether it's even poetry or not, some people have gone on to debate that as well. But the truth is that they do reach massive audiences. They manage to move massive audiences, most of the time women, as you will see in the comments, people were sharing them, reposting them, adding to them in some different context or the other. And what they do, and this is my sort of my final point that I want to make, what they do is that they produce cultures of being affected, of a certain kind of intimacy that is generated online, even as there is a lack of physical presence, physical embodiment, like I'm saying. So they give rise to what has been termed by internet theorists, cyber theorists, including Zizi Papachari, as affective publics. And she says they are network publics that are sustained by online media, but also by modalities of affective intensity. So this feeling of being moved enough to do something, to read, to consume, but then go further and share it and repost it or whatever else, comment on it. That allows you to become a part of a very intimate sort of network, a network that is sustained by this feeling, this sense of being with someone, or this sense of belonging to something. She goes on to say, affect is present through the intensity that permeates the stream and the networked rhythms of storytelling that emerge. It is present in the rhythm and pace of storytelling, which is instant, emotive, emphatic, frequently taking the form of a nod, a clap, a nudge, and other forms of affective expression. And of course, one should here make a small comment about how affect is understood as a nebulous, a nascent, sort of an amorphous entity that derives its potential from its not yet formedness. So it's not a concrete emotion as yet. It's just that feeling of being moved enough, to do something. The networked infrastructures of platforms that are constituted by their ambience and their liveness, they're always already present, they're immediate, they surround you in a certain way, among other things, allow such amorphousness to prosper. So the literary, again, this is this kind of interaction between the literary characteristics of these poems, which are heavily personalized, accessible in a certain way. They play on the lyrical dimension of poetry, combined with the platform-based practices, platform-based affordances. And that interaction, the dance between the two, allows certain forms of intimacies to prosper, networked intimacies, digital intimacies to prosper, which, it's a transformation from, of course, the kind of physical intimacies of bodies interacting with one another that you find in offline spaces. And I wanted to just bring to light this kind of idea of networked intimacies, digital intimacies, and how that interacts, or how that fits within an idea of emerging feminist practices in the digital world. So I think I'll end there, and if there are any questions, that we can continue the discussion in the Q&A session. Thank you so much again. I'll just stop sharing.
Thank you, Shweta. And just give me a second. Yes, this has been very fascinating, if I may say, primarily because I wish we were doing this in person, because, oh my God, in person, this would have led to so much interesting. Both of you have done such brilliant work, and I can't wait to read more of your work. Thank you, Nandini and Shima, for laying down the foundations of your respective perspectives of how you approach or see digital world and relationships forming. Devanjana and Shita, well, I have read your chapter, but I was quite surprised it was at the same time very, looking at a very certain kind of interaction. So if I can say a very niche interaction, but also contextualizing it in the broader frame of what's going on offline and online, which is very important. So we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. So I'll combine both mine and something from the audience. You have a question, Debanjana, from Shaunak, which is, if I read that out, I also put it on the chat for everyone to read as well. India is a unique case today where the diaspora of people on the internet engaged in social media and those who are not have wide arrays of indifference between them. In the case of women, Gen Z specifically are exposed to the American culture of equal rights, which might not be applicable in the same way in India. Do you think that the women who are not exposed to such social movements might have a different worldview and take on feminist movements? Do you want to take that question, Debanjana? And after her, if anyone else wants to contextualize that in the broader frame of feminism in indigenous forms from India, I'd be all for welcoming those point of views. But yeah, that's all. Please.
Thank you for the question, because it definitely opens up the discussion to broader to the broader scope. That if we think of this American model of whether it is feminism or in the digital space, any kind of activism, we go back to that same kind of I think arguments that bell hooks did years ago, that you can have feminism, you can have this ideologies and struggles and resistances, but it does not really voice out my struggles, which are probably way more layered. I'll tell you why, because with all this inspiration or kind of impact that we can have from the global north, which is all right, but we have to remember that in our country, we have spaces like Kashmir, a conflicting zone, the Northeast, a very ignored zone, and the other areas which are tribal, which are for the Adivasis, the marginalized women come from there, and we can have certain kind of reservation somewhere, we can have certain kind of voices, spokesperson somewhere in the real world, in the digital space, but it does not really point out the specific problems of women of those areas. And how we can look at it is that I will, and this is what I am time and again trying to claim or put forward, is that we cannot look at it from a very from only a gendered lens, from a feminist lens. This gendered lens should be there, but the gendered lens should be there when we have peace talks, we have discussions on war-torn areas, we have talks on the BSF, we have talks on where to have the army and what the army did when it tried to protect us as this community, as this one particular area, as the country. So when we have those discussions of patriotism, discussions of peace talks, discussion of whether certain policies should be there in certain areas or not, the gendered lens has to be applied, employed there in those areas. Otherwise, the American model, or this any kind of like I have said, Gen Z itself is such a a very city-born, urban kind of a lingo that you can think of as very separating women of certain section of certain years, a period of time. But does that really impact the policies that people in power are making? So if we do not have that kind of impact, if we are not having any change there in policy making, in law making, while peace talks are happening, while we are discussing about a certain community being safe at this point of time, or they need certain kind of any kind of protection or anything, are we thinking about women separately? Are we looking at their issues? Are we looking at the socio-economic backgrounds of women? But and to bring into more into focus that there are widows of certain refugees, widows of widows of people who are martyred by certain governments or policies, or even it can be terrorism anywhere. Women become, and we know that then women become the victims of multiple kinds of power dynamics. So there we cannot have a singular discussion of say, as you have pointed out, that one kind of engagement on the internet, that this Gen Z or this American culture of equal rights. Then if we impose that kind of an equal right, that would be really a kind of a compulsion, a kind of a model to follow, which we do not have in actual, in our reality. We cannot follow a kind of homogeneity, even in that kind of a resistance. We have to look at the specific areas, their issues, and use gendered lens to understand, as I've said, praxis, to understand law, to understand policies. Then only I think we can have our own, our own Indian model of resistance, which is layered, which is networked, which is, also very multifaceted. We cannot have one kind of it. We also have this caste class dynamic. We do not have only, we do not have racial in that way. We have regional, we have caste, we have socioeconomic backgrounds, that difference. And then we can talk about digital divide as well. So in that way, I think it is very different to have, and it's important to have our Indian model of cyber feminism. So my work kind of looks at that Indian model, at how we can think of our own model of cyber feminism, and why not? It can happen in that structured way, networked way, and multi-layered way. It will be complicated, but it is essential to have that. So I will just, that is how I look at it.
I do agree, and I believe Shramana has something to add. So over to you, Shramana.
Oh, yeah, I just, I wanted to add on to this point, because I think I somewhat agree with Debanjana, but there are a couple of things that I think are important to also point out, where I might maybe not disagree, but just wanted to add in something. Firstly, I think that it's absolutely true, and this is the idea. This one sort of type of privileged sort of narratives that are often there, which is not just about feminism, tend to dominate, and come out of urban spaces, and the marginalization. I think one part of what sort of I have also realized through the work is exactly that continuous loop is about the fact that not just discourses from offline carry on online, but marginalizations also carry on. So that is why I started by saying that, that it was expected that it was kind of equalizing force, but it isn't, right? And it, the same kind of divides continue. But I do want to point out two things. Just one is, actually, this question is essentially about intersectional feminism and understanding intersectional identities. And this idea has already emerged. Even before this has already been there, raised a lot, coming a lot out of sort of Black feminist literature, a lot of work from South Africa, a lot of work from post war and conflict zones, where also women have said that this feminism that has dominated the idea of feminism for the last few decades is essentially white feminism, and it doesn't represent. So this is not just this idea of intersectionality, that feminism cuts with race, with region, with class, with caste, is an idea that exists, right? So it's not just about what Gen Z is doing. It is about the fact that it has taken us a long time to talk about intersectional feminism. And actually, what some of the discourses that we found, essentially, when I was talking about choice feminism, exactly says that. It talks about sort of Savarna feminism, right? So the very fact that it's, that there are people using these terms, which we know has existed, right? So if you take the Indian context, a lot of the feminist movement and discourses, again, is urban, is upper caste, is women who have gone to these college campuses, representing us, I would say. And it doesn't represent all the feminist struggles and all the sort of different difficulties. That's my first point, that it's there and it has been there for a while. And that work is also there. It's just about sort of taking those discourses and also looking at digital feminism through that lens. The second thing I want to say is, sometimes I feel that because digital media is just so vast and so much happening, I also think that sometimes our own lenses, which come out of traditional disciplinary expectations, fall short of really kind of analyzing adequately what's going on. Because I do agree with Debanjana that does in the digital space do certain kinds of this a lot of it being influenced by American mainstream debates, politics. Does that dominate, right? I would say it does, but it also does as to where you are looking at. Because if you take what I find so interesting about TikTok, is look at the kind of presence that TikTok has. Look at the kind of videos that women who are from women, men, everybody who are from these remote parts of the world. And when you look at it, there's a lot of like backlash also, so there's this movement between Twitter users and YouTube versus TikTok. Essentially, it's a class movement. So those who use YouTube basically look down on the kind of material that comes on TikTok. But TikTok was able, because of the kind of nature of videos that were coming, was being used by a wide array of people. And there's so many accounts on Instagram now that TikTok is not there, of women from various demographics kind of expressing themselves, not just in terms of profession, but also just like making dance videos, just like making makeup videos or whatever it is, right? So I think that it's also important sometimes what is really happening on digital media, the fact that it may be reinforcing the same kind of marginalizations, but at the same time, still providing that space where maybe we are not even able to imagine the kind of expanse, the kind of reach that it's been able to create. And I think that's a question for traditional disciplinary lenses also, that how do you really deal? How do you really study? How do you really analyze what's actually there on digital platforms? So that's what I wanted to add as well.
I do agree, and I do feel you touched upon something very critical. The space is not as democratic as we think it is. Online isn't. But in the sense of power dynamics, it may be different between platforms, but there is as much as a marginalization as there is empowerment for different demographics. It's also with the current, you did say that YouTube people look down um, on TikTokers, but I do think that is also a demographic that would look down. I think with the Gen Z, TikTok is the thing to be on. Even I think they moved on from Insta as well. I think we are the generation that is still stuck on YouTube and Facebook. And our parents who probably are on the WhatsApp University, that generation. But I'd like to, because we're very short on time and I have so many questions, but I'm going to pick something from Debanjana's and drawing from your point about the commercial aspect, the capitalistic aspect. And one of the reasons perhaps that YouTube sells better than TikTok, it's because it has been monetized more successfully. TikTok is fairly recent. There is money everywhere, even on Insta. And I remember you said a very interesting thing about the impact of capitalism and how the capitalist structure of the digital space, how that compares with the ephemerality of the issues that are being discussed, particularly if we talk about feminism. I'm not going to come back to you. I want Nandini and Shweta, because Shweta, you talked a lot about memory as well. So from your perspective of what you talked, and Nandini, from your postmodernist neoliberal perspective, would you want to comment on this as well?
Yeah, sure. Who would go first?
You can go first, Nandini, then I'll take it up.
So one of the things I always think about as a literary scholar is about forms, right? That's one of the things that you are taught to think through when you study literature. And I keep going back to the issue of form on the digital media platforms. And part of it is that every digital media has its own form and format. And as an individual posting on these platforms, you can never really go against that. You have to kind of accommodate your content within that given form and format. So, and I would go back to this idea of kind of, the celebratory idea of social media or the digital platforms as liberatory, because they're not. So in a way, I think that when we kind of consent to post on any of these platforms, we agree, right? It's an unwritten contract, maybe even a written contract, that I'm going to stick to the form, the word limit, to the idea of visuals, which this particular platform is endowing me with. And they always endow us with only a limited set of tools. But in a way, they become invisible through this repeated use, and the way I think also our subjectivities around choice. And I mean, in life, right, as in kind of, I'm going back to the question of capitalism, we are always choosing, especially now, between shitty choice A and shitty choice B. So, and I think that social media replicates that on a larger scale. So there is not much of freedom in the social media to begin with. And with each post, each like, each comment we make, and the political economists have worked on that. Someone like Jodi Dean, she has done extensive studies on what does it actually mean in terms of the capitalist profit mechanism, to think of what do each of our links, comments, posts mean. But at the same time, I don't want to sound too much like a conspiracy theorist, right? Partly because I think that we operate within certain systems, within certain forms, and we make use of them. So in a way, the social media platforms do become, for whatever ends, propaganda platforms, where we, and I mean, you can share an extremely misogynist song, as you can share a feminist, Dalit feminist, working class feminist video or a message. And I'm not getting into which one gets more share, which one gets more hits, but we can use it for both ends, of course. And again, there too, right? If we have been observing the patterns of control, kind of the invisible control in social media, it's not at all unbiased right now. If your account can get suspended because if you are sharing a certain kind of content. So I think the very idea of the social media being free, the social media being democratic, the social media being liberatory is an illusion, which once we begin to use that, it doesn't really hold together very well. And I would begin from there to think about the issues which we as feminists deal with, especially when we try to think of questions of intersectionality, questions of marginalized, how the marginalized women and kind of the other sections too use social media for a lack of a better word, quote unquote progressive or liberatory political goals, because it's by no means, it's a kind of a free democratic world. In multiple ways, we are already consenting to certain things when we begin to use social media.
If I can take it from that, I completely agree with the first point that you brought up about form. I think it's very important that we go back to that. But I would like to say here that even within the prescribed form of every social media platform, I think there is enough room for creativity. And I say that as someone who endlessly watches a lot of reels on YouTube, and I have seen people use that 1 minute space for 1,000 different things. There are videos that will sort of integrate storytelling with cooking, with is the most mundane of things, like what I do in a day can be used to sort of drive forward a point. So there is, I think, even within that kind of limitation, and I think that goes back to something that Shramana was saying, within that limitation, there is enough to sort of play on it, to make it something else, to, there is room. And that goes for the larger point that I'm trying to make about, of course, there is always going to be, this talk of capitalist appropriation. It's at the end of the day, these are controlled by profit margins and all of that. I understand. But I still would like to believe that there is something organic about virality, about what, sometimes it defies logics of capitalism, of profit, of consumption. And I think, and that's the whole thing, it can't be controlled in a certain way, which plays to nobody's advantages in certain, So I think that if one can sort of focus on that and focus on the modalities of how this works, I think that's the fascinating point about digital media at this point of time.
Yeah, can I just one
Yeah.
thing? A couple of sentences. Yeah, I mean, I'm not at all discounting the creativity of individual users or even the groups, right? We all try to do that. And it's almost like learning to write poems that you oftentimes work within certain rhythms, certain forms, certain number of lines, sonnets, whatever the other formats might be, villanelle, whatever. Yeah, so the idea that, and that's also very foundational to the creativity and art, that you have certain constraints in order to make you more creative, right? So constraints are not necessarily about making one less creative, but I was kind of talking about the structural nature of things, that how it is already given, and where we actually need to think about the structural and its interaction with the individual creativity to make sense of social media and its larger politics.
Thank you. I mean, I had a lot more questions, but and things to talk about, and we didn't get to talk about the bear issue. But maybe that's for next Saturday when I have a working paper presentation as well. I will let Smriti take over. She has a question, I think, for this panel. She has been raising her hand. So I'll let her take over, but thank you so much, panelists, and thank you for the audience for attending. This is by far one of the most attended panels, symposium in ideas. So thank you, and thank you for the interesting discussions. Smriti, over to you if you want to address the panel, and then if you want to start with yours next.
I'm glad that you invited me to join early. This has been very fascinating. I am myself invested in the questions of feminism and social media and what it is doing. I'm really thankful to all the panelists. It's really helpful to bounce off your ideas and think about ways in which to reimagine the ideas. And I would trail off this particular panel by taking a leaf out of what Shramana was talking about, which is to also reflect on the limits of the discipline and the ways in which we are able to access or interpret or make sense of the reality that we are encountering. And in that sense, when we think about and when we debate and we make sweeping kind of statements like, it's not really a democratic process, but then what has really been a democratic process for women's movement? Women's movement emerged as a resistance to the ways in which they were being structured, to the ways in which women's experiences were silenced and structured across history, across academia, across political discourses, social discourses. So what really has been democratic for women's experiences, as opposed to and drawing from what Professor Nandini was talking about in terms of, let's think about the form. And so my submission would be that as an interdisciplinary panel, we think about the need to not reconcile these fractures, much as feminism has done. The need to sit with the discomfort that some of these will coexist, some of these overlap, some of these do not neatly fit in. And that's perfectly fine. It's not a democratic space, but if you just think about the form that social media has, which has brought down the cost of production to a point that a larger participation is possible, to the ways in which it's performative. It's performative for me to be able to say something that puts me in solidarity with something which is happening outside, to participate in the formation of a political and social discourse which is much larger than just my opinion, which is what history has taught ages and generations of women to do, to keep quiet, to, this is your opinion, nobody wants to hear your political opinion, to have a platform and a space where you can not just put it out, but also align yourself with the ideas and shared experiences of other women. Which takes me to what Shweta was highlighting, which is that this affectual sense of, I am seen. My bodily hair is not gross. There needs to be some ways of making sense of this experience, and there are no available platforms that also make it personal for me to just sit in a corner, access something which is deeply personal experience, while participating in a larger political discourse. So the affordances of the internet and the social media have made it possible for much larger cross-section of women to be able to just simply do that one big act of political resistance that feminism talks about, stating the experience, which women have been silenced for centuries against. In terms of, I do feel like there is a need to think about, just reflecting on the first question that had come, in terms of thinking about our own context, the level of the scale of violence against women, which exists in the social political discourse currently, the normalization of it. If you look at what is happening in Karnataka, if you look at what happened in Sandesh Kheli, if you look at number of other things which are happening across, the rapists being celebrated, and just the level of political violence that women are facing currently, there is that. And at the same time, there is this movement which I would classify as post-feminism, that feminism reaped its benefit, we no longer need feminism. There's, I am not a feminist, I can cook. I'm not a feminist, I enjoy dressing up. That kind of an idea coinciding alongside these reels that I'm seeing of young women stepping into or putting on the engagement ring and suddenly being faced with the drudgery of household work. These transition reels are coinciding. And we have to be able to sit with this disciplinary inadequacy to deal with how we make sense of all of it without making a sweeping statement and trying to put it in one frame. That's the only submission I have, but I thoroughly enjoyed the talk. It was really, really fascinating. I'm a feminist too, and I like to think about some of the ways in which Gen Z or woke culture and media scripts are borrowed. But so are ideas. And I'd like to leave at that optimist note that Shweta had, which is that there is a malleability. You don't have to borrow, but sure, look at another person and use their perspective to reflect on your own self. That's how Dalit feminism emerged, gained its voice and its presentation. So yes, I feel like this had been a very fascinating, interesting discussion. And I thank all the panelists. Thank you for your time. I think unless there is anything that Paulomi you want to add, I can. All right. Thank you so much. It was great, lovely. And I hope to, at some point of time, bump into some of you and talk to you more about your ideas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
And with that, we would proceed to the next panel, which will take this discussion further into thinking about a broader perspective of looking at youth and the digital cultures and social media. With a lot of excitement, I can see that some of the panelists have already joined. Thank you so much for joining us. for this panel. You have tuned into the panel discussion on youth and digital cultures and social media. I would quickly introduce the theme. And I would just take from what we were discussing already in terms of how social media allows certain kinds of affordances, and what does that mean when we say digital cultures or internet cultures. I'd like to draw from Nisbet and say that we have to think of it in terms of internet-mediated cultures. Some fractures that exist already in cultures get adapted into the internet realm, and how what we experience as affordances of the internet are also limited by the ways in which we're able to access the internet, or the ways in which we experience being on the internet or being online or going on social media. And I have a brilliant line of speakers who are going to reflect on that theme really well for me. So without further ado, I'm glad to welcome Professor Srila Sarkar, Chitra Adkar, Tapushi. Just 1 second. Just give me 1 second. I think my screen is frozen. Yes, we have Rahul Advani, Chitra Adkar, Tripti Chandola, and Srila Sarkar who are joining us for this particular panel. And I'm really excited because I had a chance to glance through their works, and it seems to be a very promising panel. So without further ado, I would like to welcome all the panelists. I cannot see Rahul at the moment, but he's promised that he'll be joining soon. So I'm going to go, I'll quickly introduce all the panelists and then we can proceed. Rahul is a sociocultural anthropologist and ethnographer with an expertise in the digital lives of young Indians. Prior to beginning his PhD at the Indian Institute at King's College London, Rahul worked as a research assistant at the Indian Institute of South Asian Studies at the NUS, and was a tutor at the South Asian Studies Program, SASP, and co-authored the book Singapore and India Towards a Shared Future. His doctoral thesis titled Online and Real Lives, The Anthropology of Facebook and Friendship Among Middle-Class Young Men in the Indian City, explores themes of friendship, youth, consumer cultures, cities, and digital technologies. He explores answers to questions around youth and digital behavior by developing innovative research designs that deep dive into consumer-specific needs and aspirations. Tripta is an ethnographer, writer, and editor. She's based in India. Tripta is an academic content and copy editor for the past 2 decades. In the course of her career, Tripta has had a rich experience of working with students, early career researchers, established academics, and artists across the discipline. She's currently immersed in Marxist philosophy and Zizek. She is critically engaging with math studies as a disciplinary location, with autoethnography as a methodological tool to make sense of the multiplicities of the self that present themselves in what she calls her madness, using Hegel's prescription to explore and expose true self-consciousness. For her project, matters of soundscapes as material artifacts, voice and listening as philosophical conundrums are key concerns, for which sound studies and sensorial anthropology emerges as core engagement. Chitra is an assistant professor at Sophia College for Women, Mumbai. She has recently submitted her doctoral thesis at the Center for Study of Social Systems, JNU, in December 2023. Her doctoral work is in the field of digital sociology, and it studies public groups on social networking platforms, including YouTube and Facebook. She holds an MPhil and MA in sociology. She has authored 2 research papers in the field related to her MPhil and PhD research work. She has also co-authored a chapter titled Humorous Masculinity, Nepali Men in Mediated Indian Male Gaze. In her book, Humor and Performance of Power in South Asia, Anxiety, Laughter, and Politics in Unstable Times, which looks into the constructions of hegemonic masculinity vis-a-vis humor. Professor Srila Sarkar is an associate professor at Santa Clara University. Her ethnographic research studies the institutional and cultural politics of information and communication technology for development, which is ICTD, initiatives in global India,